Chapter 2. Everyone whirled at the sound of the blast. Everyone saw Crazy Charlie's body twitch convulsively and fall to the floor, chest blown apart, bits of rib and heart and lung scattered like confetti in the plaster dust. "It's a setup!" Carr bellowed as he drew his magnum. A streamer of Crazy Charlie's blood had drawn a dark red line across his boot. "It's not, Carr, I swear," Lamb began. "Someone's outside," Lamb's second-in-command shouted. "Cover me." He kicked a half-rotted board off the nearest window and leaned out, assault rifle ready in his hands. "I'll take care of it, Lamb," he said. "Whoever the shooter is." That was as far as he got. The sentence ended in a gurgle and a grunt as the man was yanked out, tearing more boards away as he was dragged upward, legs kicking wildly, spine arching unnaturally. Half a dozen weapons were cocked and ready now, searching for targets as Carr grabbed Lamb's tie and shoved the .357 up under his rival's chin. "You son of a bitch!" Carr roared. "We're 5 floors up. Who the hell is out there?" "I don't know," Lamb shrieked. "Not my men." Then realization dawned in Lamb's eyes. "Colombians," he said. "Fuck the Colombians," Carr replied. He shoved Lamb away and looked over his men. Hatchek and Edgy and Bonomo, standing there with their weapons ready, aimed at the windows, just waiting the word. Lamb's men were looking at him expectantly, and their weapons were aimed at the windows too. "You and me will finish up later, Lamb," Carr said. "Right now I'm for blowing the balls off whoever's out there, and I don't give a shit if it's the Colombians or the cops or fucking Santa Claus." He waved to his men. "Do it!" The room exploded in gunfire, in an unbearable chaos of sound and flash, as Carr and Lamb's men all opened fire on the room's outer wall. Splinters flew, planking shredding under the hail of gunfire, the plaster showered from ancient walls. Window frames cracked, sagged, collapsed, lathe and studding shattered, and the brick veneer beyond crumbled as the barrage continued, round after round of high-caliber ammo blasting at the aging structure. Carr's delighted yelling as he pumped rounds from his magnum was almost inaudible over the noise. At last, as ammunition was exhausted, fire ceased. The echoes died away, booming down through the streets below, and the last fragments of wood, plaster and masonry rattled to rest. When his ears stopped ringing and he could hear again, Carr exclaimed happily, "That was fun!" He blinked drifting dust and gun smoke from his eyes and looked at the gaping hole where 2 of the 3 windows had been. They were completely gone, leaving a hole 7 feet high and 10 feet wide through which New York's famous skyline glowed in outline, black against the fading sunset. "Nice view," he remarked. "Jesus," Lamb said, surveying the destruction. There was no sign of the man who had been yanked out the window, he noticed. The body must have fallen to the street, along with the remains of whoever had done the yanking. Nothing could have lived through that firestorm. Edgy, Bonomo, and Hatchek looked at the wreckage, at their leaders, and began reloading. Lamb's men did the same. Crazy Charlie's corpse lay ignored under a coating of debris, in a surprisingly small pool of blood. Each side had lost a man, but the leaders were still talking. Nobody aimed anything. Lamb stepped forward, toward the hole, with the intention of looking down at the sidewalk to count the bodies. Carr's heavy hand on his shoulder held him back. "Now, about that treaty," Carr began, grinning. Lamb didn't turn. He still stared at the hole, at the broken line of bricks where a window had been. "Oh my God," he whispered. Carr glanced at the hole, just like that sorry excuse for a man to be impressed by a blown-out wall. He and his men carried guns. Hadn't they ever seen what they could do before? Then Carr saw where Lamb was staring. There was a hand holding on to the bricks. Or was there? It seemed to flicker as Carr looked. At first he saw a big yellowish hand with long black nails, then a ghostly blue flicker like faint sparks jumping. And then the hand was gone, and there were just the bricks and a shimmering in the hot air. "What is that?" Lamb asked. The hand was back, and this time it stayed. A big, strong hand, bigger than Carr's own, with nails like claws, and Carl realised it wasn't human. It had to be a fake, one of those costume gloves you could buy in the discount stores. It was moving. Someone was trying to climb up into the room. Someone somehow had lived through that barrage. Whoever it was must have been on the floor below, out of the line of fire. Carl let go of Lamb's shoulder and stepped back, 357 at the ready. Whoever it was in the monster gloves must have thought he was being cute with those things. "Son of a bitch thinks it's Halloween," Carr said, as the fingers flexed and a shadowy shape rose into view. "Hey, bozo!" He pointed the heavy pistol. "Trick or treat." He pulled the trigger. Then the world fell in on him. 6 blocks away, Rash handed Schaefer a plastic cup that was not steaming. Ordinarily, that might have pissed Rash off, but in this heat, he didn't think he cared if the coffee was cold. At least something was. He took a gulp from his own cup and almost spat it out again. The stuff tasted like raw liver. "Jesus," he said. "Why would anyone pay gang prices for drugs? A cup of this will make him feel just as awful for $1/2." When Schaefer didn't respond, Rash glanced at him and saw that Schaefer was sitting motionless, staring up out the car window, the coffee untasted in his hand. "What is it?" Rash asked uneasily. Schaefer had been acting weirder than usual today, and while Rash didn't believe in any of that psychic shit, he knew Schaefer could pick up on stuff other people missed. His weird moods usually meant trouble. Worried, Rash leaned over and looked out past Schaefer's shoulder. All he saw was empty sky, darkening to indigo. The first few stars were appearing. "Something's wrong," Schaefer said. "The city doesn't feel right." Rash snorted and straightened up. "That's like saying battery acid doesn't taste right, Schaefer. This is New York, remember? The city where we busted a satanic cow cult last month? Well, good old Al Napolitano blew away his wife a couple of hours ago because she wouldn't change the channel." "I know that," Schaefer said. "But this is something else. Was that thunder a few minutes ago?" "I didn't hear anything," Rash said. "I was in there." He jerked a thumb at Bud's Deli and Diner. "I thought you might have heard it anyway. Loud. Didn't sound right." Rash stared at his partner in disgust. They'd been together for 6 years, but every so often Rash still forgot how weird Schaefer could be when he started getting mystical. How the hell could thunder not sound right? It was probably heat lightning or something. "Sounded like guns," Schaefer said. "Like a fucking army. But it must have been thunder, right? Who'd be firing that much at once?" Before Rash could reply, the car radio crackled. "All units in vicinity respond. Shots fired. Corner of Beekman and Water." "That was it," Schaefer said, and Rash almost thought he could see Schaefer's face relax in relief. "Like a fucking army. Roll." That would figure. Schaefer being relieved that the sound really was guns. Anyone else would be scared, but Schaefer was more concerned that he might be losing his feel for the city rather than that they were about to drive into a war zone. Rash climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door. "At least it'll be that much longer before we have to write up the TV critic," he muttered as he turned the key. The streets were running the wrong way, and traffic and the junk along the curbs were thicker than usual, but not bad enough to make Rash use the lights or siren. So by the time they arrived on the scene, 4 other cars were already there, uniforms cordoning off the area around an abandoned 5-story walk-up tenement. One of them jumped in front of Schaefer as he climbed out of the car. "Sorry, Detective Schaefer," the officer said. "I've got orders to keep the building clear of all personnel until Captain McComb arrives. He wants to handle this one himself." Schaefer nodded once, slowly, but Rash didn't like the set of his partner's shoulders. He knew that Schaefer wanted to get in there, get after whoever it was that had put out that roar like thunder. Well, he'd have to wait. Rash looked up at the building, just a casual glance, but he found himself staring. A chunk of brick wall on the 5th floor had been blown out, littering the sidewalk with debris. It looked as if a bomb had gone off, not like anything done with firearms. And he could hear distant thumping somewhere in that direction. Not guns, something else. "What the hell?" he said. "Shots fired? Not an explosion?" One of the uniforms heard him. "Yes, sir," he said. "A lot of shots." "That wasn't a bomb, did that?" Rash asked, pointing at the hole. The patrolman glanced up. "We don't know," he admitted, "but we heard shots. Lots of them. Like a gang war or something." He shrugged. "So far, we've got him tagged for reckless endangerment, illegal discharge of a firearm within city limits. God only knows how many violations of the Sullivan Act. Disorderly conduct? Hell, we can throw in exceeding noise restrictions." Just then, a sharp crack sounded as boards burst out from one of the fifth-floor windows, followed by a gurgling scream as the man whose body had burst them sailed out across the street and plummeted to a hard landing atop a police cruiser, shattering light bar and windshield spectacularly. Shocked into silence, the cops all stared for a moment as shards of glass and plastic tinkled to the pavement and across the cruiser's hood, and as broken boards thumped and clattered to the neighbouring sidewalk. Then the silence broke as men hurried to check on the condition of the fallen figure, and someone called in for an ambulance. No, several ambulances. The patrolman who'd been talking to Rash swallowed and said, "Guess we can add destruction of property to the list." Somewhere above, gunfire rattled, and a shrill scream was suddenly cut off short. Calmly, Schaefer drew his 9mm service pistol and chambered a round. "Screw McComb," he said. The officer who had met him at the car door stepped back. "I guess we can make an exception for that non-admittance thing, Detective Schaefer. If you feel it's warranted, I mean, you're here. The captain isn't." He was still babbling when Schaefer pushed past and trotted into the building, pistol ready. Rash followed, grumbling and tugging his own piece from its holster. The door was open, the ground floor hallway empty and dim. Rash followed Schaefer up to the stairwell, pistol gripped firmly in both hands. Up above he could hear hoarse shouts and loud thumps. "Sounds like a ninja movie up there," he said quietly. "Who the hell do you think's up there, Schaefer? Isn't this Lamb's turf?" Schaefer grunted affirmatively. "Gangbang Central," he said. "Lamb uses it when he takes his goddamn meetings." He took a look up into the darkness, then headed up the stairs, weapon ready. The middle floors were dark and silent. Rash took a quick glance down each hallway, pistol aimed at nothing, and saw only garbage and emptiness. Schaefer didn't bother to even look. He was headed where the action was. On the fifth floor, dim light spilled into the hallway from an open door. The thumping had stopped, but someone was screaming steadily. A scream of pain and terror like nothing Rash had ever heard before. Gunsmoke was drifting in the air, and the whole place reeked of it. "Jesus, you hear that?" Rash asked, crouching on the top step. "Yeah," Schaefer said, standing in the hallway. "They're really starting to piss me off in there." The scream ended in a choking gurgle. "Cover me," Schaefer said, as he approached the door, his back to the wall. "I'm going in." Rash didn't bother to reply. Schaefer didn't give him time anyway. Almost as soon as he'd finished speaking, Schaefer was around the doorframe, charging into the room with his gun ready. Rash moved cautiously up the corridor, back to the wall, trying to ignore the fact that there were a dozen goddamn bullet holes in that wall, and his back was sliding right across them, begging for another few high-velocity rounds to come punching out. He heard Schaefer's footsteps go in, then stop somewhere in the middle of the room. And then he didn't hear anything but a thick dripping sound, like steak sauce going on. "Oh, Christ," Rash muttered to himself, very quietly. He imagined that he could feel the wrongness now, the same thing Schaefer had mentioned back at Bud's Deli. Something wasn't right. The all-out firefight, the blown-out wall, now that heavy silence, and something intangible and indefiably wrong, in a way that the city had never been wrong before, in all the years Rash had lived there. Just as Schaefer had said. "Schaefer," Rash called quietly. Schaefer didn't answer. Rash heard his boots scuff on grit, but Schaefer didn't say anything at all. Rash stepped forward, pistol ready, and swung around the doorframe. Then he stopped, frozen, staring into the room beyond. It's odd, what goes through a person's head at certain times, or at least Rash thought so. as he took in what lay beyond the doorway, because what he immediately thought of, upon seeing it, was his mother. He remembered her holding him, crooning soothingly to him, when he was maybe 4 or 5 years old. He remembered the soft touch of her hands and how long and thin her fingers seemed, and how one curl of her hair brushed against his forehead as she held him close. The rest of the memory came back, and he decided that maybe it wasn't so very odd after all. Because the reason she'd been holding him and comforting him is that he'd woken up screaming in the darkness, shaking uncontrollably with nameless terror after some nightmare he couldn't remember, something about monsters in the night, about suffocating in his own blood, about the things that wanted to hurt him. And she had rocked him gently in her arms and had told him softly, "Those bad things are just dreams. They're not real. They can't hurt you. There are no monsters in the night. Not really." As he looked at the big room on the 5th floor, the room where one wall had been partly shot away, the room littered with broken glass and spattered blood and plaster dust, the room where his unflappable partner Schaefer was standing dumbstruck, Rash knew that his mother had lied. Because the monsters had to be real. Nothing else could have done this. The 2 cops stared silently for a long moment. Finally Schaefer spoke. "Gang war my ass," he said.